Hello everybody and welcome to another video. This week we're going to be looking once again at our lizard overlords because it's time to show you how I paint them. I'm hoping this will be simple and easy to follow. Let's crack on. So our test subjects for today are going to be these three Croxagores. Yes, they're the Age of Sigmar ones because the metal ones from the original Warhammer Fantasy Battle are really showing their age. The first step is to spray them with any kind of grey primer. I'm using Ghoul Grey, which is the Colourforge's equivalent of Grey Seer from Citadel. It's also cheaper, so I do recommend using that. Our first, most important, and my favourite colour to use on these guys is Reptilian green. This is going to be put all over the scales. Make sure that you do this somewhat neatly, leaving the underbelly completely covered in primer as much as you can. If you go over areas like the bangles and weapon shaft, not really a big problem, we'll come back to those later. My advice here is just take your time and let it dry at the end. I base coated all of these guys in about 10 minutes, it didn't take too long. You will probably need a second coat later on just to cover up any gaps, as sometimes contrast paint doesn't cover quite completely. For the underbelly and any areas on the legs and arms that weren't covered with Reptilian green, I'm going to use Gryph-Charger Grey. I don't use this paint very often, but for covering off the lower areas of these lizards, it's absolutely perfect. If a little bit of this happens to get onto your Reptilian green, it's not really a problem, and if anything it's slightly desired because it helps that blend just a little bit more. Onto another contrast paint, we're going to quickly use Baraknar Burgundy all over the tongue and the jaws. I'm using a slightly more detailed brush here as I don't want to get this anywhere on the skin. For the weapon hafts, we're keeping it simple with a single coat of Wildwood. Now, as I mentioned, it doesn't matter too much if you get a little bit of Reptilian green over these wooden areas, but where you can, do try to avoid it because it is slightly see-through. As well as doing the weapon halves, I also use this for the leather bangles and necklaces all over the lizards. If you're doing Croxagore or whether you're just doing regular Saurus warriors, you'll find these everywhere anyway. Now for all the totem areas, I'm using Baal Red, which is easily my favourite contrast red. If for any reason you happen to get any of your scale colour or skin colour on these, just paint a little bit of white over them, let it dry, and then use your Baal Red. For this giant 70s necklace, or anything that looks like a standard, I'm going to use Pterodon Turquoise. It's another colour in a similar family to Reptilian green, and I think it works really well for that slight differentiation between totems and the scales themselves. You could completely reverse this scheme if you wanted to, and use them for the opposite way around. For all the rocks, but not the stones on the weapons, I'm going to use Basilicanum Grey, and then I'm going to use Warp Lightning all over the plant life that comes with these models. I also went back and used Wildwood all over the tree trunk on the base of this guy. Now for my favourite part, the little frogs. I'm using Doomfire Magenta on this frog and switching up some other bright colours for the other two frogs on the other bases. These include Gryph-Hound Orange, which is a nice bright orange for this little frog, and Shyish Purple for the other guy, which is a little dark, but I wanted a bit more colour on the base. With the best parts of the model now complete, and yes, I was talking about the frogs, it's time to go back to the weapons and do all the stone parts on there. Now you could use Basilicanum Grey, but I've not been using that on my other lizards, so I'm sticking with my scheme, but if you want to use the contrast paint, do go ahead. For my weapons, I'm using AK's German Grey. Just a normal acrylic paint that I'm thinning down and painting all over the stone areas. Simple as that, it's a normal base coat. On these specific models, it's slightly more time consuming as their weapons are so massive, but if you're using it on normal Saurus warriors, you probably won't spend too long on this part of the scheme, because they've only got little spears. For the next step, we're going to use yet another normal acrylic paint in the form of Steel Legion Drab. I'm using this for all the claws, fingernails, and also all of those horn parts over these specific weapons. Another area to specifically watch out for on these models that's slightly different to your normal Saurus warriors is the giant spikes all over the tail. I did personally consider painting these in the same colour as all the scales, but I ended up preferring the Steel Legion Drab. It's worthwhile, even though it takes a little bit more time. I mentioned claws, nails and weapon horn, but it's also worth putting it on the teeth, don't forget those, and this also helps you tidy up any blends between the Baraknar Burgundy and the blue skin. Once we've completed all of the bone and horn areas, it's time for possibly the longest part of painting this model, and it's adding all of the metallics. I'm using top brass from the wonderful Two Thin Coats range by Duncan. This is somewhat similar to Games Workshop's Runelord brass, but I think it covers a lot better and I much prefer using it, so I do recommend. This is for all the areas that you think should be metal, which for me includes the tails, the trim around the weapons, and all the bangles and jewels hanging off these lizards. I think a brassy colour is absolutely perfect for this because it contrasts against the bright skin and all the other areas we've done really nicely. Now, as mentioned earlier, it's really important to go back and clean up where the contrast paint hasn't necessarily fully covered. So just take your time and you'll notice this as you go along as you're painting other areas where the contrast paint might have missed. For the stone now, I'm going to do a really simple highlight just using some AK Silver Grey. A normal white paint or grey paint will work here too, just to make it look a little bit more chipped and chalky. Likewise, I'm going over all those areas that I covered in Steel Legion Drab with Zandri Dust, and that'll be my final highlight for those areas. When it comes to highlighting all of those Baal red areas, I'm actually going to switch straight to an orange and use Troll Slayer orange to highlight these areas. It just makes it look that little bit brighter. Now for the final highlights, it's really super simple. I'm using the aptly named Temple Guard Blue to highlight some of the sharpest areas all over the scales. You'll note there's a few areas I haven't bothered highlighting on this paint scheme, and that's to keep it quick and easy. And everything's so bright and almost riotous on these guys, I don't think you need it. One highlight that I didn't mention that happened slightly before this is just to use a little bit of Gauss Blaster Green to highlight up that medallion around the leader's neck. Now, as you can see, I'm literally just adding this highlight to all the sharp spikes and the giant armor plates on the back of the models, and also maybe a few areas on the legs where they're exposed to the sun. That completes the highlighting stage and 90% of the paint job. The final thing to do is add some white dots into the eyes, and then using a nice yellow contrast paint, I'm going to use Imperial Fist, give them a good yellow glow. So there you go, super quick, super easy. These guys were painted in a really quick time period, and it would have been a lot faster if I'd used the hairdryer to dry those initial contrast paints. You could have probably knocked these out in about an hour and a half. I really enjoyed painting these, and I really enjoy getting the army on the table so quickly, so I do recommend trying this if you're considering painting lizardmen for Old World or Age of Sigmar. If you want to see how I base these, check out last week's video. As always, I hope you've enjoyed this. I've been Sam. I'll see you next time.